Hi everyone, welcome to Class 5 of FX PhD After Effects for Broadcast Design. This is Tim Clapham here. This week it's not going to be such a project-based class, but what we are going to do is we're going to have a look at 3D applications and using multipass and what we can do with that in After Effects. And also we're going to have a look at exporting camera data and things like that and how we can use those. And finally we'll have a look at some 3D passes and how we can use them with third-party effects such as trapcode form, because I know a lot of you have been asking for that in the forum, so we'll have a quick look at that at the end of the lesson. Now for these examples I'll be using Cinema 4D, but we won't really be doing any work actually in the 3D application, and most 3D apps will allow you to output multipass, so as long as you know which buttons to press in your 3D program, you should be able to follow on. I'll also supply you with some of the renderings that I show you in the class so that you can mess around with them yourself in After Effects. So let's crack on. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you an example scene and we'll have a look at the passes that I've generated, and we'll just go through in After Effects and see what we can do and the advantages of this. So let's just go to Cinema 4D. As you can see, there's quite a simple scene that I've set up here. I've got these cylinders going into the background, we've got some shadows, we've got a kind of transparent object with refraction and some reflections, and then again another kind of highly glossy reflective object. Now the thing with multipass is that what basically happens is you render separate elements each as their own movie, and then you composite them together. So you would render your shadows as one pass, your specular as another, the diffuse lighting as another, things like that. So if we come into the render settings here, and we'll just quickly have a look at that, and we go to multipass, you can see I've set up a few different passes: diffuse, specular, shadow, reflection, refraction, etc. We've also got a couple of passes here we've got the depth pass and two object buffers, which is obviously unique and wouldn't show up in a normal RGB render. In case you're wondering what an object buffer is, it's basically a way of kind of isolating single objects. It's a bit like an alpha channel just for one object. So there we go, there's our scene. I'm just going to hide this and show you the renders that came out from that. So here we are in After Effects, and you can see I've opened up all the different passes over here in the project window. Now this is the RGB pass that we can see here. Now for instance, if we wanted to kind of change things on this, it'd be quite difficult to isolate specific elements such as the shadows and the specular and things. So say we want to kind of make the shadows slightly lighter and change the colour of them. It's not an easy thing to do, because obviously it's all one composite image. This is where multipass really comes into its own. So I've created a comp in After Effects. I'll just open that. Okay, there you go. So you can see that the comp here looks pretty much exactly the same as the plain RGB render. That's the two there. Okay, there is a slight difference here in the refraction. I'm not sure why that is. So in our multipass comp, you can see I have all the layers down here, which are all the different passes. If I just press F4, you can see that they're all set to different composite modes. So let's just have a look at each pass. So I'll solo the diffuse. Here you can see it's just the diffuse colour. So if we wanted to do some basic colour correction, you could do it in here. We have the specular pass. You can see that it just isolates the specular highlights. You can see also that that is set to add mode. So it's only the white part that will actually appear in our composite. We have a shadow pass. This is set to multiply. We also have the reflection pass. And we have a transparency or refraction pass. So when we combine all these together, you can see it creates a composite image, just the same as our full RGB render. Okay, I'm just going to unsolo all these so it's back to normal. So let's have a look at how we can kind of manipulate each pass. Now the beauty of multipass is that when you're sitting with a client and they say, oh, can you just change the colour of that, Oh, could you make the speculars brighter? Oh, can we just lower the opacity of the shadow? Things like that. It means you can do it really easily without having to re-render the 3D. Obviously this is quite a simple scene, so re-rendering wouldn't take too long, but with more complex scenes, multi-pass is very essential, and it means you can have kind of easily manipulate the image and revert back if you need to as well, so it gives you a lot more control for experimentation. So let's go through each pass. Let's have a look at the diffuse pass first of all. Okay, we could just do a slight bit of colour correction with this if we wanted. Let's adjust the hue a small amount. Okay, you can see how that works. Now you will notice that where the floor etc. is refracting through this sphere, it's not affecting that. And that's because that's a pass of its own here as well. So if you wanted to do this kind of colour correction, you'd probably want to add this same effect to this layer and possibly link them with an expression so that you don't have to adjust both effects. I'm just going to copy that and paste it into that layer. And now you can see that blends in perfectly okay. The next pass we have is the specular pass, so that just isolates the specular highlights. You can see it's set to add mode. We could do the same here. We could adjust the colour of it, or we could just lower the opacity. Or your client may turn around to you and say, can we make them brighter? Can we have a bit of glow on them? So you could duplicate that layer. Let's just isolate that. And then maybe, add levels. And we can bring that white so it's much brighter. Add a blur of some kind. Okay, so if we unsolo that layer now, you can see we've got this bright glow. Switch it on and off just so you can see the difference. And if maybe that's too high, you can just pull it back a bit by adjusting the opacity. So let's just set that to say 50. The next pass in our comp is the shadow pass, so let's have a look at that. Now because it's black and white essentially, you could use it as a matte. So for instance, you could have some text in your 3D program that's casting a shadow. You could then use the shadow pass from that to kind of matte out some video or something like that. That'd be quite creative use. In this example, I'm just going to show you a couple of things you could do. For instance, just lowering the opacity, or you could colour them, so I'm just going to do that. Let's use CC toner. Okay, you can see it's already affected them. Let's give it a sort of bluish tint. Okay, so there we go. So if we switch that effect on and off, you can see that it's changing the shadow quite drastically. We can always adjust the blend with the original value here to make it slightly more subtle. And then let's just drop the opacity back slightly. Okay. Now the next one is the reflection pass. I'm just going to solo that. So you see that we can see the reflection on both our spheres. How about if we just want to mess around with them on this sphere on the left? This is where our object buffers come in. So we have this object buffer. There we go. As you can see, it's just black and white. It's essentially a matte for that object. So if we come back to our comp, drag that in above our reflection, and then set our reflection to Luma Matte. If I just isolate that layer by soloing it, you can see that we've isolated the reflection for just that one sphere. So you can see the control that you can get is pretty good. At the moment, we'll just be adjusting the reflection on just the one object. If you wanted to change that without having multi-pass, you'd have to do a full re-render of the whole scene. So I'm just going to add a very slight blur to that. 2 iterations. Okay, there you go. You can see we've now got slightly blurry reflections on that object. You have to be careful when using blur with buffers and things like that, because obviously the blur will bleed over the edges and you can get quite an edge showing up, so you have to be quite subtle with that. But obviously using the object buffers allows you to do plenty more than just blur. Now you may have noticed that by isolating that reflection, we've lost the reflection on the other sphere. So how can we fix that? The easiest way to do it is just to duplicate the two layers. I'm just going to select the bottom one and remove the blur, and if we change our track matte to Luma inverted, okay, and we can solo that layer, you can see it's using the inverse of our matte, so that object is now visible, or that reflection path, should I say. And then finally, in this comp, we have the transparency or refraction pass. We've already added the hue saturation effect so that it matches the background. You could do other stuff to it. I'm just going to lower the opacity slightly. I think you get the idea now. Just so it's slightly more opaque. Let's make it 60. So hopefully that's given you some ideas of how you can use multi-pass. I'm going to show you a few more examples and then we'll jump in and I'll have a look at some real-world examples of how we've used it on projects in the past. There's another pass that I just want to show you. I've rendered an ambient occlusion pass. So if we have a look at that, you can see the effect that that has. Now I didn't actually render the RGB with the ambient occlusion pass, I just rendered it separately. I wasn't sure whether or not I needed it. But if we just drag that in on top of everything, set that to multiply, okay, you can see the effect that that has. Maybe that's a bit too strong, but you can just, again, lower the opacity on that. And it's quite subtle, but it kind of helps to sit the objects onto the floor. And the last thing we're going to look at in this example is the depth pass. So let's have a look at that. So basically what that does is it uses grayscale values. You can set that up in your camera based on kind of focal length, or the focal distance should I say, which is this black point, and then that gradually gradiates towards white in both directions. Now you can use this with quite a few effects. For instance, Trapcode Particular has an option for using a depth pass, so you can clip the particles at a certain depth, things like that. That's quite handy if you're trying to add particles into a 3D scene and you want to go behind objects, stuff like that. Perhaps the most obvious use for it though is to add some depth of field. Now using a depth pass with depth of field does have its limitations, but very often it's a slightly more versatile way of doing it and rendering it in your 3D program. Also you can do stuff like simulate rack focus, things like that. So let's go back to our comp. I'm going to add in a solid. I'm going to set this to be an adjustment layer. I'm going to also drag in my depth pass. Doesn't really matter where that goes because I'm going to hide it anyway. Select my adjustment layer and let's add lens blur. Okay, at the moment it's on its default settings, it's blurring the whole image. First of all, let's repeat edge pixels to get rid of this around the edges. The blur's really high, let's just set that to about 3. So in this effect you have an option to choose depth map layer. So if we just choose our our depth pass, and let's crank up the radius of the blur just to see the effect. Okay, so you can see here it's blurring a lot more, and over here it is. These are very blurry. And what you can then do is adjust the focal distance. So if I just drag that quite high, you can see this is now sharper and these are blurrier. The only problem with using a depth map for depth of field is sometimes you get problems like just here. This is because the matte is matting them out, and this is quite a bit further in the background, so you can get artifacts, so you just have to watch out for that. But as you can see, it's pretty useful, makes for a lot more options in post. So if we just have a quick look at our original PSD, there's the original render that we came, and now we've messed around with it, and that's what we've ended up with. So it's a pretty drastic difference. Obviously not the most artistic example, but hopefully that gives you an idea of why to use multipass and some of the options available to you when you do. So let's move on and have a look at some examples of how I've used that in the past on real projects. So this is a TV spot we did for Discovery Channel. Let's have a quick look at that, and then I'll go through some of the techniques and the passes, etc. that we used to create this.
At discoverychannel.co.uk, you can explore the past, present and future worlds. Download your favourite Discovery programmes. Test your knowledge and play free interactive games. Talk to the experts and have your say. Or get personal with the guys at Orange County Choppers. The world at your fingertips. discoverychannel.co.uk.
There you go. Okay, so let's open up After Effects and see some of the tricks that we used on that. So we're in, excuse me. So we're in After Effects. As you can see, there's quite a few comps for this project, and there's also quite a few renders. I'm not going to show you how the whole project was built. I'm just going to show you a few relevant points. The first thing I want to talk about is exporting camera data. Now, Cinema 4D has that built in, which is very handy. For other 3D programs, you may need to buy a third-party plugin. There's one for 3D Studio Max called Max to AE, which you have to purchase. You can also do it from Maya using the .ma file. Basically, the advantage of that is that you can bring the camera into After Effects. What it essentially does is it bakes all the keyframes. So you get a key on every frame, and this is how the Cinema 4D one works. So if I just press U to open that up, you can see we've got keys for point of interest, position, orientation, and zoom. Now, as we've added a camera in there, what that means is any 3D layers we add in After Effects will match that camera move. So that makes it really, really useful. In this example here, all the background is pretty much After Effects layers. The map here is an After Effects layer. Although the 3D is sitting on it and it's got kind of shadows, etc., onto that map layer is still just an After Effects 3D layer. An obvious example of how you might use this is if, for instance, you have to kind of replace a billboard or something like that. So if it was, or like a big jumbo screen. So if you'd made it in 3D and rendered it out, but the client wanted 10 variations, you wouldn't particularly want to render it out 10 times. In the old days, what we'd probably do is track the corners of it and then use corner pinning, and you could do it in After Effects like that. But now, because we can export cameras out of lots of 3D programs, and After Effects has 3D layers, it's just a simple matter of creating a 3D layer and placing it in the right position. So that's great for workflow. It makes changes much easier without re-rendering your 3D. So when you're starting projects, always kind of try and consider whether that kind of thing is an option or not, what sort of passes you're going to need, how you need to separate your 3D elements. If we look at this example here, as well as the 3D layer with the map on it, we also have this plane whizzing through with a kind of smoke trail coming from it. Now that smoke trail is done with particular and it's added here in After Effects. Obviously that isn't done using camera data, but very often you can also export other elements. So for instance with Cinema 4D, if you add any lights into your scene, it will also export those, and when you open it in After Effects, you'll have After Effects lights in the scene. The great thing with that is that you can use the After Effects lights to light your 3D solids, and the lighting will match the actual 3D render. So what happens is the 3D render sits in the background as a 2D layer, and you add in your After Effects 3D layers above that. And as I say, they use the lights and camera that you've exported. With this example, we've exported lights, and as you can probably remember from the particular lesson, you can use lights with particular as effector emitter points. So in 3D and Cinema 4D, we've basically attached the lights to the back of the plane. When we've done the export, the lights have come through. If I just open up Spitfire Smoke here, okay, you can see there's our 3 lights, the camera as well from the 3D project, and then we have particular, and it's using those lights as its emitter points. The only reason it's a pre-comp here is just because there's so many layers, and to actually have that in the main comp that we were looking at before would just clutter it up and it would make it slightly more difficult to work with. So I'll just close that down. If we go back to this guides elements, which is where we were before, okay, I'm just going to jump to the beginning of this comp. What I've done is I've just RAM previewed a short section at the beginning. I just wanted to show you another example of kind of using the After Effects 3D layers with the exported camera. As you can see in this example, we've got quite a few layers in the background. The star field's made with particular, and then there's several layers of fractal noise. As you know, that particular is already a 3D effect, so you can see that working. And we've also got these layers of noise, etc. So as the camera zooms into the surface of the planet, you get a really nice sense of depth in the background, and it matches perfectly with our 3D render. Here's another comp from the same project, and again, just to demonstrate the same principle. As you can see in the background, we've got this kind of mountain range as a vector sort of shape. We've also got these white rays poking out, and then we've got some kind of particular fireworks, and they all match perfectly with the 3D. This is because, again, we've exported the camera. Cool stuff. And here's one more example of that. Again, the background layers are 3D. You can see we've got some nice multiplaning, more particular, some white rays, and for the exhaust here, we placed a light inside each one, and we've used that with particular, similar in a way to the plane. So there you go, that's the kind of pre-comp for the particle smoke coming out of the exhausts. So I've jumped back to the comp we were looking at before. If we open up the treasure map comp, you can see here we've got the camera from 3D, and as we scrub through, the After Effects layers all match the camera movement. So when we go back to here, our intro guides, we now know that this map layer is an After Effects layer, whereas this bit above it is a 3D layer. If you remember at the beginning of the class, I mentioned the ambient occlusion pass. Now we've output an ambient occlusion pass here. There we go, I've just soloed that layer for you. That's obviously 3D. But the thing with that is, if we take that and multiply it over our After Effects layers, it will kind of sit the 3D onto that layer. It will make it, it'll give us the impression that they're actually sitting on that layer. So if I unsolo it and switch the ambient occlusion layer off, you can see that now all these objects appear to just float in space. But just by adding that occlusion pass, multiply it over the top, all those models and objects look like they're sitting on top of our map. So that's a good way of kind of compositing 3D onto After Effects layers, and just makes it a little bit more convincing. So the last thing I'm going to show you on this project is just how we used object buffers. Now we used them to help with the transitions. Obviously, to build this whole project in 3D, if you built it in one scene, it would be a mammoth task. So we built it in kind of 4 or 5 scenes, and then in After Effects created some transitions. So I'll show you an example of one of those. This comp here is the comp where we created the transitions and sort of edited each section together. Just ran previewing the end of the first part, so you can see the camera pulls back. So in 3D what we did is we then take that camera into our next scene and use the keys from the very end of the camera move as the beginning of the next camera move for the next shot. So theoretically both cameras will match up perfectly. So at this point here we're going to need to transition into the next shot. This is the beginning of the next shot that it transitions to. The camera pulls out of the monitor screen. So what we did in Cinema is we kind of selected the screen object and we added that as an object buffer. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first reason was because the client wanted to produce 4 different versions of this spot, and they wanted on one of them the screen to have text, and on the others for the screen to have clips from the actual programs. The other reason we created the object buffer is so we could use it as a mat to create our transition. So I've got a comp here with a mat in it. If we scrub back to the beginning, you can see it's totally black, and as we pull out, we've adjusted the opacity of the mat, and that's the screen, and that's the thing that we use for the transition. So combine those 2 shots together, use that mat as a transition, and this is the result that we came up with. works pretty well. We use that a few times throughout the project. I'll show you one more example of that. So you can see here it zooms through the bridge. To achieve this, we kind of created just a polygon that fitted into the gap between the bridge, added an object buffer to that, and used that for our transition, just as we did before. We used object buffers quite a lot throughout the project. Here's another quick example. If you notice that we've got a star glow and a slight blur on the treasure chests. Again, oh, it's got solo, sorry. There's the object buffer that we created in 3D. We can use that to then, excuse me, we can use that to isolate just the inside of the treasure chest, and then take that into our main comp and add the star glow, etc. Like so. Obviously there's quite a lot more that went into this project. Haven't really got time to go through it. I've got a few more other things that I want to show you, but that should give you a good idea of how you can kind of use your camera data and data from lights or null objects, etc., with adding elements in After Effects, and also a few examples of using passes like the ambient occlusion pass and object buffers, stuff like that. So I'm just going to close this down and move on to something else. So when we did the particular lesson a couple of weeks ago, there was a little bit of response in the forums that I did say that I might mention a little bit about form, and I didn't get around to it, so I'm going to kind of combine that with this class. The thing is, with form you can use kind of layer maps, so what I've done is output a few 3D passes, and then I'm just going to show you how you can use those with that effect. What we've got here is we've got a depth pass. This is just a kind of model of a Ferrari, and I've just kind of animated it moving forward, and as you can see you get this grayscale image of the car. Now it's much whiter here than it is at the black. We can use that to control the particles within form. And the other pass that I've imported was a kind of normal pass. Now this shows the normal direction of each polygon, and what that essentially is the way that the direction that it points out. Okay, this is a bit of an unconventional use for normal passes. You can use these for quite a few things, but what we're going to do is we're just going to use it to colour our form particles. So in this comp I've added a layer, I've added form to that layer, and I've also added a new camera. I'm only going to use Z depth of 1, the number of particles, and I'm going to set the size to be 1024 by 576 and 0 in Z. So you can see now we have a kind of a grid array, or a grid of particles created by form. It's the same size as our comp window. I can just use the camera tools to kind of move around. So what I'm going to do is just pull back slightly and rotate it around a little bit so you can sort of see the 3D effect. I'm going to set the number of particles in X to 102. That's because we've got 1024 width, and that's kind of easily divisible. And then 57. I actually think I want it denser than that, so I'm going to go 1024 particles by 576. So essentially it's a solid mass of dots. If we come down in the effects palette to layer maps, in here we can choose different maps for our colour and alpha, displacement, size, and we can also control the strength of some of the other effects. So if we come to size and choose Ferrari depth, and then map over X, Y, you can also map it in Z. Now everything's disappeared. The reason for that is because if you look at the depth map that we're using, it's totally black at the beginning. If I just solo that layer, as we come through, the car appears. So switch these off again. If I move forward on form, okay, you can see that's now affecting our particle size. Again, this is a 3D layer. There we go, as I move around there. It's got a lot of particles, so we're not actually getting real time. But I'm sure you get the idea. Just undo that. If we come back to the the trapcode form effect, open up colour and alpha, and let's choose our normal map for colour. We then have to specify how we like to map it, so we'll map it over X, Y. There we go, so you can see that's now added those colours to our particles. It all looks rather dense at the moment. It's not very advantageous doing it this way. It doesn't look much different than the original render. Another option in form is to use strings. Grid is kind of like lots of points. Strings is essentially lots of particles all really close to each other to create lines. If we just reduce the number of strings in Y down to kind of 114, you can see now it's made up of lots and lots of lines. Another thing we can do is we can use the displacement. We could use our depth map for this, and we map it over X, Y. Okay, now it's actually displacing the particles. Pretty crazy result. As it's a 3D effect, we can kind of move around, rotate around, and you can see that it is actually displacing those particles in Z depth. Just going to undo that and undo the strength of the displacement. Now in this example I'm just using the default particle. Form's very similar to trapcode. Trapcode particular, a lot of the settings you'll notice are the same. So again, you could use a custom particle. It could be an animated particle, it could be a little star, in which case you're going to make this up from that. So how about kind of a quick example of what you might do with something like this. Jump to the end of the comp. I'm going to set the displacement to 0 and then add a key for that. Jump to the beginning and then set this to say 100. I'm totally guessing these values, but hopefully it'll work out okay. If we scroll down the effect, you can notice that we've got kind of a fractal field option. We can use that to affect the size. Let's just jump forward so we can see our car. So if we affect the size, there you go, quite extreme. Let's just say that a little bit lower. Okay, now that's a fractal, like fractal noise that you probably used in After Effects, and it's essentially using that fractal to scale the particles up and down. You can also use this to adjust opacity. What I'm going to do though is I'm just going to set it to affect displace. So I'm going to just jump to the end, set a key so displacement's at 0, jump back up to about here, and let's just kind of see what happens if we displace that. Okay, so it might be a little bit difficult for you to see. I'll just take that down a little bit lower. So you can see it's displaced all the particles based on the fractal noise, so now it looks totally chaotic. But if we jump down to here and move our key to the beginning, it's gradually going to kind of undisplace itself. So I'll just round preview that so you can see the result. And there we go. I've increased the size of the particle to 2 just so you can see a bit more clearly what's going on, but you should get the idea. Now the thing is, you don't necessarily, have to use passes from 3D for this kind of thing. If you don't have a 3D program, you could always use video. You could do some animation, stuff like that, and you can use those as layer maps. It's a great way of creating some cool techniques, especially if you use kind of people's faces, things like that. Okay, rather a simple use for form, but that might give you some ideas of how you can use your 3D passes in a slightly obscure way. I'm just going to close this down and show you one more example using form. In the forums there was a little bit of discussion on an example that Trapcode have on their site, which was done by, I think it was Digital Kitchen. Now I'm not going to try and recreate that, I don't think that's quite right, someone else's work. Kudos to them, it's a great example. But what they'd basically done is they'd used a lot of their 3D passes to control the particles in form, similar to the way I did with the Ferrari a moment ago. So look in the project window here, I've got a few renders. Okay, here we see kind of RGB pass. I think I'll switch the reflection off later. What I've done is I've links are light to each hand and to the head and to the hips, and they're all different colours. So as he runs along, you see all the lights. I've also output a depth map, a diffuse, a normal map, and a UV map. Now the UVs on this are pretty messed up, so you're getting some quite wacky results, but you could certainly use that to create some crazy stuff with form. I've created a new comp. I've added in just the diffuse pass for now, and then above that I've added in a solid layer which has form applied to it. If we look at the base form, it's the same size as the comp window, and there's the number of particles. In layer maps, I've set it to use our running diffuse movie for colour and alpha, and also for the size of the particles. So if we just switch that on and scrub through, you see that we get a sort of halftone effect of the running man. Okay, so that's just the beginning. Then what you can do is take this and layer it up, so you've got several examples of form, one on top of the other, and they could all use different layer maps. So I've added another layer of form, and I've also added in the depth map. So if we come back to form here, I've set it up for strings this time with only 25 strings in Y, and the particle size is quite size 4. I've added a colour map here in Quick Maps where I've just used this blue gradient and then set it to map it over Z. So if we come down to our colour and alpha, what I want to do, I'm going to just A to A, it means alpha to alpha. So I'm going to take the alpha from the diffuse map first of all. Okay, so now we have our guy running along. It's already looking pretty cool. How about if we use our depth map to adjust the size? There we go, so the grayscale values of our depth map are now adjusting the size of those particles. And then if we maybe displace it slightly, so select our depth map for that too. Okay, there you go. Let's just reduce this down to say 35. Quick look at that. Okay, so we're already getting some quite wacky results. What I'll do is I'll supply you with these renders, and you can all mess around and have a go yourself and see what kind of things you can come up with. So I've added in another layer with form, this time using this normal map. Just switch that off. So in the effect, what I've done here is I've set the size of the sphere to 8. I've then used a colour map here, which I've just kind of randomly clicking on random. Like I said, I'm making this up as I go along. Okay, so whatever. I've not mapped that over Y, so the gradient runs along the Y-axis. Again, I've used the alpha channel from the diffuse layer just to cut the person out. And I've used the normal map to displace it, but this time in -50. If I just set that to 0, you can see this is what we'd have solo that. That would be our kind of layer without any displacement. Pretty cool anyway. You can see someone running in it even though it's just a few lines. So if we set this strength to -50, it kind of pushes them all out. Unsolo that, and we can see all our layers together. I've managed to create a bit of a mess really, but it's still quite an interesting result. You can still see that it's someone running, even though it's just a random collection of particles. So that all looks quite good. I'm sure if you had a bit more time, you guys could come up with something a lot more interesting than this, so I will give you the files as I say, and hopefully we'll see some cool results in the forums. There's one other thing I'm just going to do with this, which is with particular. So when I exported the project out, I also exported all the light information from Cinema 4D. So here we are with that comp open. I've added another layer at the top and added particular to that. Now each of these lights has got a unique name, so in this effect I've put right foot emitter, which is this bottom lay down here. So we're going to use that as our emission point. So if I just move forward in time slightly, you can see that we're getting some particles emitting from this point. Now if we use a technique that we used in the original particular lesson, what we can do is we can make a solid trail of that. And if we do that for each one of those lights, we're going to get quite a cool effect. So let me just select the particular layer, set it to say 1000. If we set the emitter size to 0, it's all coming from one point. Velocity 0. And now if we come down to particle and we go size over life, and we just set that to be a ramp down. And then the lifespan of each particle, shall we say 1 second. Actually I've set that to 0.5. So let's just preview that. So we've got quite a cool motion path or particular path coming off of that foot. The particles are taking their colour from the light. I used all different colours on the lights, which is why this guy's lit up lots of different colours. I mean, if we wanted to change that, we just open up the light and we can change the colour here, it doesn't matter now. So we can make it yellow if we like. And there you go. So I'm just going to actually dupe that and set it up for each light just to show you the result that we get. Okay, so I've duped the layer and I've gone through, I've left all the settings the same apart from I've gone into the options on particular and I've just changed the name of the light so it corresponds with the correct part in here. So if we just switch off our movie layer so we can't actually see our guy, and let's just round preview that. You can see we're getting some pretty crazy results. Now if it was a seamless walk cycle, seamless loop, it would probably flow a lot better. I just wanted to do this as an example. It's actually using an FBX file, which you can get quite a lot of free ones from the web. So if you do have a 3D program, download a few FBXs, attach some lights to the skeletons, and then mess around in here and see what kind of effects you can come up with. Obviously these colours are a bit garish and stuff like that, but it should give you some ideas of stuff to do. So just for the hell of it, I've dragged that comp into the comp we were working on before with form and combined the two. And I've made quite a mess really, but you know, it's good fun. Hopefully that will inspire you to create something a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. So that's about it for this week. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. Hope it's given you some ideas of how to use your multipass renders in After Effects to kind of complement your After Effects layers. We've also had a look at Trapco form and how we can use our layers, our renders from 3D to kind of influence the size, the displacement, colour, etc. of particles. And then lastly, I just showed you a quick example of how attaching lights to a kind of an animated object, such as a run cycle, things like that, and then the effects you can create with it. Pretty cool stuff. Well, thanks for watching, everyone. Look forward to your comments in the forum. We've got a week off next week. I'm not actually going to set a particular assignment for this because it was a bit of a hodgepodge of lots of different techniques and methods rather than one project as all the previous ones have been. But I will give you these files as I say, and hopefully you guys can come up with some more interesting things than this. So that's it. See you in the forums. Have a good week. Just one other thing before I go. I'll just talk about what we're going to do for the next 5 classes. The first 2 classes will be kind of creating an animation using purely After Effects. We'll be using lots of 3D layers and possibly particles and stuff, but we'll be using some of the tricks and techniques that we discussed in the previous classes, and over 2 lessons we should come up with quite a funky groovy animation. After that, what we're going to do is the last 3 classes will be creating promo. We'll be using some 3D. What I'll probably do is pre-render that for you, and then we'll look at how we can composite that together using multi-passes, bringing in our camera information, stuff like that. So it should complement the lesson that you've just watched. So there you go, that's it guys and girls. Have a great week, and I'll see you on the forums.